Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Banner Lecture Series at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I'm your host, Adam Scherer, Vice President for Collections and Exhibitions. We're so glad to have you all join us today for a virtual version of the program. We thought we were through this, but there have been some mitigating circumstances which we'll work through and hope to see you all in person at the VMHC for our next Banner Lecture in January. As always, thank you so much for your support. We could not do this program and all of our other public programs without our members, and so we greatly appreciate your support. Before we start today's program, just want to run through quickly some upcoming programs that I hope you'll mark your calendars for. On Monday, December 13th at 10 a.m., we'll have the next installment of our Curator Conversations program. This is a members-only program. That will be a virtual program. The title of the program is New to the Collection, where we'll join VMHC curators as they share the remarkable stories behind their favorite objects that have been added to the collections in 2021. That evening at 7 p.m., we'll feature another virtual program, History in Our Homes. This is a new special program. It is free, but registration is required. This is a program that will help participants identify the history and important stories that can often be found in their attics, basements, and trunks. Panelists will discuss how to preserve and care for these treasures, as well as the process that museums use to collect objects and family papers. This program is a collaboration between the local chapters of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia, and the VMHC. On December 14th at 7 p.m., we will continue our movie myth-busting program, which is also a virtual program. The featured film will be A Christmas Story. We will have special guests from the Science Museum of Virginia that will discuss STEM-related scenes like the infamous Triple Dog Dare. And for those of you who are familiar with the story, you'll know what that means. Our next Banner Lecture, which again I hope we'll all see each other in person for, is on January 13th at noon. Mary DeCredico will be here talking about her book, Confederate Citadel, Richmond and Its People at War. But today we're very pleased to have with us from across the pond, Bruce Ragsdale. Bruce is going to be talking about his book, Washington at the Plow, the Founding Farmer and the Question of Slavery. For more than 40 years, George Washington was dedicated to an innovative and experimental course of farming at Mount Vernon, where he sought to demonstrate the benefits of recent advances in British agriculture. Those methods also shaped Washington's management of enslaved labor, and he was at the forefront of efforts to adapt slavery to new kinds of farming. His inability to reconcile the ideals of enlightened farming with coerced labor was critical to his decision to free the enslaved people under his control. Washington at the Plow enhances the more familiar biography of our first president and offers a new perspective on the founder's response to abolitionist appeals. Bruce served for 20 years as the director of the Federal Judicial History Office at the Federal Judicial Center. He's been a fellow at the Washington Library at Mount Vernon and the International Center for Jefferson Studies. And we're very pleased to have Bruce with us today. Bruce?
Right. Thank you, Adam. And I'm delighted to be here, even if virtually. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture has played an enormously important role in my whole life as a scholar, dating back many years since I was in graduate school. Always one of my favorite places to do research, and I'm delighted that I could present this book talk to an audience through the museum today. Washington's life as a farmer is the most important untold story of what is probably the most familiar of the founders. And I started the project with the conviction that no one can fully understand Washington without some sense of why he so preferred his life as a farmer and what he hoped to achieve as a farmer and contribute to the establishment of the new nation. A British visitor to Mount Vernon in 1785 reported that Washington's greatest pride following the Revolutionary War was to be considered the first farmer of America. Washington's been celebrated for many firsts, but First Farmer of America is one title that's been lost to the nation's memory of him. And one of the things I wanted to do is to find out why that accolade would have been so important to him, especially in the years just immediately following his victory in the Revolutionary War that had secured American independence. But then he turns his attentions almost entirely to farming at Mount Vernon. I also wanted to uncover a side of the private side of Washington that's seldom evident in his life as a military leader or as president. He considered farming the activity that was best suited to his disposition. It certainly gave him the greatest pleasure. He said it was more rewarding than any string of military victories could ever be. And also you see in his life as a farmer someone who's deeply connected to the natural world around him, someone of enormous intellectual curiosity, and also someone who was determined to be connected with a transnational community of enlightened agricultural leaders and landowners on both sides of the Atlantic. But farming was never just a private enterprise for Washington. He thought agriculture would be one of the most important foundation for the commercial prosperity of the new nation. It would be a source of its respectability among a community of nations. And he expected the type of farming that he demonstrated at Mount Vernon to secure that commercial prosperity for the new nation. At every stage in his innovations in agriculture over 40 years, he's paying attention to a much broader economic vision than just what he's trying to do at his own private estate. First, that's evident in his transition away from tobacco, which he abandons in 1765, and transition to wheat, a crop that could be marketed outside the restrictions of empire that had limited the tobacco trade by the time he became a full-time planter. And then again, following independence, when he introduces a very elaborate system of diversified farming that he thought would unite much of the nation in a common commercial enterprise. And so he saw his farming as one more manifestation of his leadership in trying to establish a lasting foundation for the United States. In his own lifetime, farming was also an important component of the celebration of a heroic Washington, and the most important expression of that image of the farmer as hero is in Richmond, in the standing statue of Washington that was commissioned of the French sculptor Houdon by the Virginia State Assembly to be in the center of the state capitol. When Washington returned to his life as a farmer following his service in the Continental Army, he was hailed in the United States and in Europe as the American Cincinnatus, regularly compared to the Roman leader who had left the farm to defend the Republic in battle, and then when offered arbitrary power, rejected that offer and returned to his life as a farmer. And the image of Cincinnatus at the plow in the 18th century, it serves as a sort of paragon of civic virtue. And the presentation of Washington at the plow was a demonstration of his own virtue, made all the more powerful by the fact that he actually was returning to a life of farming. Houdon presents Washington with the plow at his, the mold board is there at the feet, and then alongside him is the plow. And in Houdon's representation, After consulting with Franklin and Jefferson and also getting some input from Washington, he decided to present Washington in modern dress rather than ancient dress associated with Cincinnatus usually. And he's presented not with the plow normally associated with Cincinnatus, but rather with a drill plow, something Washington had designed his own drill plow. It was manufactured by the enslaved carpenters and blacksmiths at Mount Vernon. And here it is presented in this sculpture. The plow also appears in representations of Washington when he resigns from the presidency. In this image, which was created for a dinner to celebrate his resignation in March of 1797, Washington is surrendering the symbols of military and civic authority on the throne of liberty. But with his left arm, he gestures back to Mount Vernon, and waiting for him at Mount Vernon is the plow. So these images, as these images suggest, Washington after 1783 is effectively farming on a public stage, and the veneration of Washington at the plow, this idea of the farmer doing the public good, serving the public good, really set a framework that shaped the expectations for what Washington would accomplish as a farmer. And also those are the expectations of an audience that closely followed his farming, an audience that extended to Europe as well as the United States. And those expectations of the public good that Washington would serve also framed his eventual reckoning with slavery, a new reckoning with slavery in the years following the Revolutionary War. And it's in his life as a farmer more clearly than in any other dimension of his life that we can trace Washington's changing attitude towards slavery and his ultimate, how he ultimately confronted the paradox of slavery and freedom that runs throughout the founding era. The story of Washington the farmer is the story of Washington the enslaver. Farming and enslaved labor were inseparable for all of Washington's life as a farmer. And he was closely involved with the management of enslaved labor throughout the time that he was directing agricultural work at Mount Vernon. I show this document here. It's from late in his life. It's a document that only recently came to public light about 10 years ago when it was acquired by Mount Vernon. And it's where Washington, and you can find this on Mount Vernon's website in their digital archive. It's where Washington offers a detailed description of the work and abilities of various enslaved laborers on one of his farms. It gives you a sense of just how closely attentive he was, how closely he supervised enslaved labor, and also gives you a sense that he defines the lives of the enslaved here almost entirely through their work and through their value to him. But this is just one piece of evidence that the most detailed record of his involvement with the institution of slavery and his daily interaction with individual enslaved laborers, and especially his changing attitude towards slavery, is in his records as a farmer. And over those 40 years, when he again and again is at the forefront of efforts to adapt enslaved labor to new types of farming. When I started the research for this book, I thought I had a pretty good sense of the trajectory of Washington's life as a farmer. But what I now think are two of the most important contributions of the book came in many ways as surprises. And the first surprise was just the depth of Washington's enduring commitment to British models of agricultural improvement. In the middle decades of the 18th century, there was a transformation in British agriculture that had brought about a remarkable increase in the productivity of the land. And from the very beginning of Washington's full-time management of Mount Vernon, starting in 1759, he's determined to bring the lessons of that new kind of farming from Great Britain to bear on his own estate in Virginia. And he learns about it and learns the techniques of this kind of farming almost entirely through books. And in the spring of 1759, he writes to his tobacco merchant in London and orders a whole new set of British agricultural treatises, practical treatises, books that had absolutely nothing to do with tobacco or corn or the crops that normally were grown in Virginia, but rather would introduce Washington both to the techniques of farming in Great Britain and also the culture of experiment and innovation that he adapted. One of the first and most important books he gets is that pictured here, Thomas Hale's Complete Body of Husbandry. I could trace in here lessons that he had learned about how to guide experiments and soil amendments that he used, that he implements just within a few months of receiving this book. But I also put in this frontispiece because these books not only offered practical advice that Washington took, they also introduced Washington to a different kind of culture of farming. The British advocates of what is often called the New Husbandry often compared their efforts to the great agricultural writers of antiquity, often compared what they were doing to those of the farmers of Rome and people like Virgil and Livy. And Washington also learns through these books about a culture of self-professed gentleman farmers who were deeply involved in farming, who had a practical knowledge of farming. And it was farming that not only enhanced the value of their landed estates, but also was presented as a kind of civic, even patriotic duty, that they could afford the risks of experiment that common farmers could not. And this was a model that Washington readily attached himself to, and it guided him through the rest of his life as a farmer. It was a model that he thought would give a whole new purpose and value to the kind of landed estate over which he presided in Virginia. And again, one of the other books that he orders early is this Practical Treatise of Husbandry by Duhamel, where this is the book that really guides him in the introduction of wheat as his principal cash crop. Most of Washington's agricultural library is now housed in the Boston Athenaeum, but this volume, which is one of the very few in which he's written notes in the margin, this volume is in the collection of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I was able to examine this on a visit a few years ago. Soon after the Revolutionary War, Washington announced that he would wanted to introduce a whole, what he called the complete course of English farming. And it was not just cultivation methods and types of experiments that he had introduced before the Revolutionary War, but this was a comprehensive system that involved very complicated crop rotations extending over 7 years, integrated with livestock management, and very much focused on stewardship of the land, the restoration of soil fertility. And the adoption of this course of English husbandry led him to completely redesign the agricultural landscape at Mount Vernon, and to demand that the enslaved undertake the enormous work of creating new kinds of fields for these crop rotations, and also to work on the construction of tremendous barns based on sophisticated British models. And Washington then hired an experienced English farmer who went to Mount Vernon to live and to advise him. And he also began a correspondence with some of the most influential British agricultural leaders of the time. And they became his most important confidants in the last 15 years of his life. And it was with them that he shared his growing disdain for what he thought was the destructive farming practices of most Americans. The second surprise, and closely related, was the enormous effort that Washington expended after 1785 to adapt enslaved labor to this complicated British course of farming, a system of farming that nowhere else would be so closely associated with enslaved labor. During the Revolutionary War, Washington, on a couple of occasions in correspondence with his farm manager, expresses a wish to be done with managing enslaved labor. And those remarks, combined with his few remarks endorsing the principle of gradual abolition after 1783, have led a lot of historians to assume that Washington was trying to withdraw from his direct management and reliance on enslaved labor, that he anticipated that slavery would somehow fade away as the main source of agricultural labor. And when I looked at his implementation of this English course of husbandry, I found that that was not true at all. That Washington makes a number of decisive efforts to rely more exclusively on enslaved labor after 1785. He places enslaved overseers in charge of 4 of the 5 farms at Mount Vernon. They're involved in commercial agriculture. He tries to replace the hired white artisans that he had relied on and paid for their skill in crafts. He tries to replace them with enslaved laborers, especially carpenters, who would make many of the agricultural implements that he introduced, and the bricklayers who would build the tremendous barns at Mount Vernon. Most of the enslaved laborers, of course, were working in the fields, and there Washington introduces a much greater specialization of labor, specialization by gender. Women in the fields assume much more responsibility for that work and for much of the enormous number of plowings and harrowing that is introduced as part of the English system, while the men were disproportionately put to work in artisan trades. Washington recognizes almost immediately that what he's trying to do with the merger of English agricultural practices with reliance on enslaved labor is unprecedented, and that he will find no guidance for that in any of the many books that he relies on for other kinds of agricultural advice. And he institutes a new system of supervision that's really entirely original to him. And this is an example of one of the weekly reports of work that he gathered from the overseers at each of the plantations of the 5 or 6 plantations at Mount Vernon. And these weekly reports accounted for the 6 days of work of every single enslaved laborer on the estate. They're incredibly detailed. They were an incredible resource for me, but it also shows a new level of supervision and control of labor that he institutes as part of this more complicated system of farming. He presents these in the form of double entry bookkeeping, even though they have nothing to do with any monies that are exchanged or any values of what's being produced. Each plantation is debited for the number of people who enslaved people who are working there, and then credited for the individual days of labor that so that he could supervise labor more closely, not just at Mount Vernon, but when he was away. And he relies on these reports throughout his service as president. When he's in Philadelphia, he devotes most Sundays to going over the weekly reports and then writing very detailed instructions back to his farm manager. These reports are typical of the kind of detailed records that Washington kept. Washington had a penchant for all kinds of record keeping that probably makes Mount Vernon the most thoroughly documented agricultural estate in the Chesapeake in the 18th century. And I just showed 2 examples here of just the kind of exactitude and precision that Washington brought to farming, in which he insisted from the people who worked for him. This is a design for a treading barn that he would build at one of the farms at Mount Vernon. This is from the collection of the Library of Congress. And it's his own original design. And in the space below, he gives the exact measurements that he wants the timbers to be. He differentiates between those that should be gathered and cut and dressed from the estate and those that should be brought in Alexandria. But what's really interesting is that he produces this document at one of the busiest times of his presidency. He sends it to his farm manager a week before his reelection in 1792. Earlier in the 1780s, he had put together this chart of, again, the kind of precision, mathematical precision that he brings to farming. This is his determination of exactly how many seeds of 8 kinds of crops are in a pound, in a bushel, how many are required to sow the fields. And this kind of detail is evident in other kinds of records, like the provisioning of food and clothing to the enslaved laborers. And it's really what makes it possible to recreate as much as I have been able to do here about the work and the lives of the enslaved labor. That record, of course, is always imperfect because it is created by Washington and his white farm managers, and that the enslaved played very little role. As far as we know, none of the enslaved overseers were able to write their own, had the skills to write their own reports, but they were involved in delivering the reports weekly to the farm manager. This almost obsessive attention to detail and control never obscures a much grander aspirational vision of a system of agriculture that Washington thought would connect the new nation to a world of enlightened improvement and natural investigation. This is the seal of the Society for Improving Philadelphia Society for Improving Agriculture, which was established in 1785. It's one of a new generation of agricultural improvement societies, most of which inducted Washington as a member soon after their founding. The Philadelphia Society was probably Washington's most important connection with other agricultural innovators in the United States. Like Washington, the Philadelphia Society, though they had a vision of the new nation, as you can see that they see this idea of this labor watched over by a figure that brings together both Columbia and the goddess of agriculture, Ceres. But like Washington, this society and many of the others that are formed in the United States in the 1780s is focused on trying to bring the best of British agricultural practices and methods to the United States. In the closing days of the Revolutionary War, Washington frequently made reference to his anticipated life under vine and fig tree, citing the biblical scripture that also talks about turning swords into plowshares, and talking about nations that would learn war no more. And Washington, like many of his British correspondents, like his former French colleagues who he stays, comrades in the military that he stays in touch with in the 1780s, and like members of the Philadelphia Agricultural Improvement Society, he was convinced that a focus on agricultural improvement and a shared project across national boundaries would establish a new era of peace. These advocates of improvement thought that a pursuit of agricultural improvement would replace the mercantilist restrictions on trade that they thought had only led to war and the costs of empire. And instead, they saw in the free exchange of agricultural knowledge the ability of nations to develop their most reciprocal advantages that would then serve the interests of free trade. And Washington became, for these improvement advocates, the preeminent example of someone who was turning to agricultural improvement to support this anticipated new order of peace among nations. When the great English agricultural leader, Arthur Young, learns that Washington is interested in British husbandry, he writes that he's glad to learn that the general is now a farmer. And he saw in Washington's interest in agricultural improvement and British agricultural improvement the beginnings of a new productive and collaborative relationship between the United States and Great Britain. Young offered Washington any kind of support he could provide, and he sends Washington seeds and new kinds of plows, and then probably most important, the agricultural journal that he publishes, the Annals of Agriculture, which becomes one of Washington's main guides in implementing this new system of farming. Sir John Sinclair, the founding president of the Board of Agriculture in Great Britain, also initiated a correspondence with Washington. He becomes, I think, the most important agricultural correspondent in the 1790s for Washington. And they talk about not just practical advice, but also he talks about the political economy of farming. And he writes that Washington, who was the individual who was the immediate cause of the breakup of the empire, had become, through his agricultural improvements, the most important source of the good understanding that emerges between Great Britain and the United States by the end of the 1790s. Young and Sinclair are part of a almost global network of improvement advocates who eagerly supported Washington in his innovations at Mount Vernon. This image might not seem like the signal of the beginning of a global exchange of enlightened knowledge, but in fact, this image represents Washington's first great improvement project following the Revolutionary War, when he decides that he wants to begin the breeding of mules, which had only occasionally been done in the United States and never very successfully. And he wants to breed mules because he's learned that they are superior draft animals in terms of longevity and the cost of keeping them. And in his search for a Spanish jackass, which were considered the most advantageous donkeys or jackasses to use for the breeding of mules, his search for that reveals the enormous enthusiasm and support that he would find for his improvement efforts, both in Europe and in the United States. Diplomats in Europe circulated his request for a Spanish jackass, an animal that normally was prohibited from export from Spain. And when King Charles III of Spain learns of Washington's interest, he orders that 2 of the best specimens that can be found would be sent to Washington as a gift. Only one of those animals survived the journey. That Washington named that animal Royal Gift, who is here represented in Farmer's Almanac that was published in Massachusetts soon after the animal had arrived in the United States. And as Royal Gift travels from Massachusetts, where he had landed, to Mount Vernon, he becomes a kind of celebrity, covered in newspaper reports. Prominent farmers ranging from John Jay in New York to leading political elite in South Carolina write to Washington and want to bring their mares to breed with Royal Gift. And this is, as I said, this is the first of many projects that gain attention of people really all over the Atlantic world. And over the next 15 years, Washington would be the beneficiary of this network of scientific and agricultural exchange that extended especially through the remaining parts of the British Empire, but also through the reach of American diplomats. Washington receives wheat from Cape Colony of Southern Africa, the Barbary Coast. He receives kind of cotton from China. He gets breeding stock from both Europe and the West Indies. And then most importantly, he gets an enormous number of agricultural books, most of which come from England and Scotland. As a result of these kinds of exchanges, Washington turns his entire estate into a display of his innovation. And he offered the many visitors who pilgrimaged to Mount Vernon a view of an agricultural landscape that was unlike anything else that could be seen in the United States. A visitor from Poland said that he couldn't believe Washington had never been to Europe, since he had so thoroughly and effectively incorporated European ideals of landscape design. A British visitor said he was reminded of the work of Capability Brown, the favored landscape designer of the great improved estates of England. Washington, and not just at his mansion house where he would display experimental crops, but throughout the farms. Here in a close-up of his redesign of Union Farm, you can see how he creates these vistas along this tree-lined avenue that went into the great barn that was built according to the design of Arthur Young. Throughout the estate, over the 8,000 acres of the estate at Mount Vernon, Washington creates views and vistas that would show off his agricultural improvements. He was particularly obsessed with establishing English-style hedgerows to divide the fields at Mount Vernon, even instructing his managers that he wanted labor diverted from profit-making enterprises if that was necessary to establish these hedgerows. And he explained to the farm manager that the hedges were meant to be ornamental to the farm and reputable to the farmer. And that mix of aesthetic design and a reputation as an accomplished and knowledgeable manager of an agricultural estate runs throughout Washington's presentation of his agricultural improvements. Here in one vision, a view of Mount Vernon that was painted by Edward Savage in the late 1780s or early 1790s. So at the time when many of these people are coming to Mount Vernon, this is one of the few contemporaneous views that includes housing that was provided for the enslaved laborers. To the right of the picture is the so-called house for families that was raised soon after there. But the visitors who came and saw the agricultural improvements and toured with Washington on his daily round of the multiple farms, they also, of course, observed the work of the enslaved laborers who had made possible Washington's agricultural improvements, had made possible these massive construction projects. And just as agriculturalists on both sides of the Atlantic had seen the symbolic importance of the general turned farmer, so a new generation of anti-slavery advocates were convinced that Washington's support for their cause and Washington's emancipation of the enslaved people that he controlled would immeasurably contribute to their efforts to abolish slavery in the United States. And Washington becomes, at the same time that he's introducing these new forms of agriculture and new forms of controlling and supervising enslaved labor, he becomes the most important among the founders of the objects of these abolitionist appeals. That people see Washington as the key convert into their cause. The earliest documented appeal to Washington was from Lafayette, who invited Washington to join him in an experiment that would educate enslaved laborers to be free and self-sufficient tenants. Washington also received personal appeals from religious leaders, such as the Methodist clergy, who wanted him to support a petition to the Virginia Assembly for gradual abolition, or the Quaker leaders who came to him in New York looking for support of the petitions they had submitted to Congress. The French abolitionists, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, visits Mount Vernon, and he makes a very personal appeal to Washington to be the leader of a new abolitionist society. And like many of these abolitionists, he recalls the language of liberty that associated with the principles of the American Revolution. And he says that it would be most appropriate if what the man he calls the savior of America also became the liberator of the hundreds of thousands of enslaved Blacks who remained in bondage in the United States. These appeals, many of which were far more critical, those that were in the press, would continue through the rest of Washington's life. Apart from a very few private comments that Washington made in support of the principle of gradual abolition, the only change that can be identified in Washington in his attitude towards slavery is evident in his management of agricultural labor and his plans as a farmer. And in the years after he had first heard these abolitionist appeals, he introduces a number of changes in the management of labor that he thinks will ameliorate or at least provide some shield against what he perceives to be the most brutal and inhumane aspects of slavery. He resolves to end the purchase or sale of enslaved laborers. He resolves to keep families together, at least within the confines of his larger estate. He insisted that his managers provide enslaved families with adequate provisions, food and clothing and medicine. And he discourages the use of violence in the coercion of labor or the punishment of enslaved people who did not provide the labor that was demanded of them. But in return for what he sees as these minimal protections of the well-being of the enslaved, Washington renews his demands for their labor. And he says that he expects in return all of the labor that they can produce given their age and constitution, and all of the labor that they would be working from sunup to sundown. And he defines this work as their duty, uses that word repeatedly to explain the sort of transactional relationship that he thinks he's establishing with the enslaved. In many ways, Washington deliberately creates silences about slavery when he was very reluctant to put things in writing about his comments about the institution of slavery. And he had famously written that he didn't like to think about, let alone talk about slavery. To Lafayette, when Lafayette approaches him about the experiment to prepare the enslaved for freedom, Washington writes back and gives a very brief statement of support, but says this will have to wait until to talk about till we meet. And that becomes the standard pattern for Washington. We're left with just minimal hints of the conversations that might have followed. But again, he did leave a remarkably detailed and meticulous record of his supervision of labor. And it's that record of farming that reveals Washington's gradual recognition of the incompatibility of slavery with his particular vision of agricultural improvement. This becomes evident particularly during the years of Washington's first term as president. He had repeatedly hired British farm managers or artisans because he wanted to draw on their knowledge and experience that they could bring to the farms. And again, he's disappointed with them, dismisses them, explicitly stating that he's dismissing them because of their inability to supervise enslaved labor in the way that he was exercising, the way he expected. And that there's a sense that somehow there's a disconnect between the management of enslaved labor and that knowledge and experience that the British farmers and artisans brought to Mount Vernon. On another level, in his travels as president, where he visits every state in the Union, and also in a remarkable survey of agriculture that he prepares for Arthur Young, Washington comes to a new understanding of the ways in which a reliance on slavery differentiates the states of Maryland and Virginia from the other states in the North, which were also involved in a similar kind of grain cultivation. And it was particularly the example of Pennsylvania, where Washington lived from nearly 7 years of his term as presidency, and where he closely observed farming in the surrounding area. And in Pennsylvania, he finally acknowledges that Pennsylvania is superior to Virginia in its agricultural improvements, not because the soil's better or because the climate's easier or has access to better transportation. He thinks Virginia has the advantage in all of those. But he ultimately concludes that it's proven in Pennsylvania is superior because Pennsylvania has enacted the gradual abolition of slavery, and Virginia has not. And he tells Sir John Sinclair, tellingly, he writes this only to a British correspondent, but he tells Sinclair that Virginia must do the same, or it will fall behind and it will lose the edge to states like Pennsylvania. By the time he writes that in 1796, Washington has no hopes that the Virginia Assembly will enact any kind of program of gradual abolition. And instead, he turns to his own plan to find some way to free the enslaved people that he controls at Mount Vernon. And in fact, this map of Mount Vernon, the survey that he draws in 1793, was not meant to memorialize his achievements in introducing this new kind of agriculture, but actually it was the first step in a plan to lease his farms. This is presented as a presentation to explain to British farmers that he wants to lease his farms to British farmers who would pay him to lease the land, and that that income would allow him to, on some level, some way never fully explained, to free the enslaved people that he controlled, while those tenants would take over and continue his agricultural improvements. The book contains what I think is the first full accounting of this plan, a very elaborate plan, even though Washington never explicitly explains every detail of it in any one place. He's constructing it over several years, and the book goes through that plan and his efforts to attract a British tenant. He's never successful in doing that. He privately says he'll never rent to lease the land to what he calls the slovenly farmers of the United States. And so when the plan came to nothing, Washington decides to hire out as many of the enslaved as he can. This is by 1799, and find other ways to employ the remaining enslaved laborers at Mount Vernon, and also begins plans to settle some of the enslaved laborers on his lands to the west. And it would only be in his death that he would provide for the freedom that he had been searching some way to reach since the 1793. And in the summer of 1799, 5 months before his unexpected death, Washington drafted the will that would provide for the freedom of over 120 enslaved individuals that he controlled at Mount Vernon. And he ensured that once freed, the aged and the infirmed would be cared for the remainder of his life. He provided that the young would be taught a trade or skills to support themselves. But in that will and in that provision for emancipation, Washington never offers any kind of principled words of opposition to the institution of slavery or condemning slavery. And he never explains what it is that he hoped would come about because of his own act of emancipation. What is pretty clear is, though, that he did not expect other Virginians, planters, to follow his lead. And indeed they didn't. And it has, in some ways, very little effect on other planters. There's no case of someone who decides to emancipate the enslaved under their control because of Washington's example. Several years after he resumed his life as a full-time farmer after the Revolutionary War, Washington had wrote a friend that he considered the life of the husband and the most delectable life of all. And he goes on to write to the friend that to see plants rise from the earth and flourish by the superior skill and bounty of the laborer fills a contemplative mind with ideas which are more easy to be conceived than expressed. It's a kind of poetic expression we don't normally associate with Washington, but one that really is at the heart of what he was trying to accomplish through this adoption of British agricultural methods. Visitors to Mount Vernon came into the most public room at the Mansion House, into the new room, would see the frieze that surrounds the room, and in the similar stucco designs on the ceiling, which Washington had designed in partnership with a stucco master who come to Mount Vernon. And these designs that Washington chose really were representative of that ideal of the natural bounty of the rural landscape and of a dignity of labor that had attracted him to British models of farming as a young planter, and which continued to guide him in his dramatic reorganization of Mount Vernon following the Revolutionary War. And his engagement with that transnational community of enlightened agricultural leaders and naturalists deepened his conviction that the kind of farming that he was demonstrating at Mount Vernon would support a new kind of commercial prosperity for the new nation that could be engaged in peaceful commerce. He was convinced that his ideas about the stewardship of the land would also ensure the political stability of an agricultural society. And those visitors also saw he chose for the crowning ornament of his mansion house, he chose for the weather vane this and helped design this weather vane of the dove of peace. And it was this dove of peace that was representative of the life of under vine and fig tree that he had talked about so much, and the associated scriptural reference to the promise of a world in which people would learn about war no more. But that ideal of rural life and agricultural bounty proved always to be in conflict with a system of labor that rested on violence and on a denial of individual liberty. And in this book, I have tried to recover a neglected and what I think is an essential dimension of Washington's life. And I also hope that it has shown that his pursuit of a particular model of agricultural improvement ultimately and uniquely convinced him that there was no place for slavery in an enlightened and prosperous republic. So thank you. And there's time for questions now. I'd be happy to take any.
Thank you, Bruce. And please, our viewers who are on YouTube and Facebook, please send your questions in, and we'll relay them to Bruce. One thing I think might be helpful, Bruce, for our viewers, you alluded to the size of the state of 8,000 acres, but give us a bit more sense of the scope of this operation and its complexity. This was quite a large operation, and for him to deploy these new agricultural techniques must have been quite a feat in coordination.
An enormous feat of coordination. By the time Washington is instituting these changes after 1785, Mount Vernon extends to almost 8,000 acres. He has by then made the final purchases, or in 1786, he makes the final purchases that he incorporates in Mount Vernon. And of those 8,000 acres, about 3,500 acres is in arable land or cultivated land. And that's tremendous size. The individual farms range from 500 to about 1,500 acres. And just as a comparison, the kind of tremendous English estates that he read about and studied about, they were usually divided into farms that were no bigger than 500 acres and managed by one farmer in that sense. So it's a very, very large operation. By 1780, when he starts this new system of farming, he conducts his first complete census of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. And in February of 1786, he enumerates 216 enslaved individuals of all ages. That number increases by 100 by the time he conducts the last census of the enslaved in 1799. And so part of the coordination and in the late 1780s and early 1790s is figuring out the allocation of those laborers. So a lot of those individuals are moved from one place to another in order to have the kind of labor force that he needs for a very complicated system of farming. There also needed to be a kind of self-direction in that farming. There's some hints of this, but also if you just look at the logistics, it could not have functioned if the enslaved were not taking some direction and control, not just the enslaved overseers, but the people who were involved in the separated tasks. Because even on a farm with 15 or 20 laborers, on any given day, there were 8 or 9 different discrete tasks being carried out by the enslaved.
And some of the documents that you showed in your presentation demonstrate that he like Jefferson was an avid record keeper, very meticulous in that respect. One of our viewers, Carol, asks whether Alexander Hamilton might have had any influence on the business side of Washington's record keeping.
No, I don't think so. I mean, he really is modeling this on agricultural examples and models. He is following what he reads about in British treatises. What I find particularly interesting is that aside, before he's involved with the Philadelphia Society, there's not much communication with other farmers in the United States. That changes a little bit after the Revolutionary War. But the direction is more toward Great Britain in learning those kinds of management. Or earlier in Washington's life, it's looking to other Virginia states. I think he learned an enormous amount in his role as the executor for the Custis estate, one of the largest and wealthiest estates in Virginia, and Washington pored over those kinds of records. He ends up managing quite differently from the Custis family had, but that's where he learns how to coordinate these kinds of records within for his own estate.
Another viewer, Jacqueline, asks, how did others view Washington's favorable opinion on English agricultural practices? So here's Washington embracing practices for agriculture from a former foe. How did his contemporaries view that?
It's a very good question. What's interesting is the kind of agricultural improvement advocates that Washington was associated with, whether they were in Philadelphia or in New York or South Carolina, shared that admiration for British agriculture. And just for some context, it's not just Americans. This is not just a kind of legacy of a colonial provincialism. British agriculture was held as the ideal to which most Europeans on the continent aspired. When Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of the other great national leaders who turns later in his life to agricultural improvement, when he undertakes agricultural experiments, like Washington, he brings a consulting farmer from Great Britain. And then it's only later that this model fades away in favor, is less favorable, in part because it is so expensive that it can only be undertaken by very wealthy landowners. And in the years after Washington's death, very quickly, agricultural improvement in the United States becomes much more localized, much more democratically based, and less beholden to those British models.
Well, somewhat related question: Did King George's reputation or accomplishments as a farmer have any influence on Washington?
That's something I have spent a lot of time trying to investigate, something I'm very interested in. I spent 2 months as Vernon's inaugural fellow with the Georgian Papers program at the Royal Archives at Windsor, going through Washington, George III's agricultural improvements. There's no direct communication. What is clear is they knew about the work of the other. Arthur Young informs Washington of what George III is doing. And what I find even more interesting is that they rely on the exact same books, and they're trying to do the exact same things. They also rely on the advice of both rely on the advice of Arthur Young and Sir John Sinclair. But it's that common connection with books that really unites the improvements of both Washington and George III. And also, both of them are not just trying to improve the works of their own estate. They're trying to provide a model and an example for their respective nations.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, showing another side of Washington I think most people are not familiar with. So thank you very much, Bruce. What are you working on now, or what's next?
Actually, I had found so much material on George III that I couldn't include in the book on Washington that I'm now going to do a very different book about the other Farmer George, and talk about both the public image of George III, which was often very satirical and critical, with his very substantive achievements as an agricultural improver at Windsor. So now that I'm living in the UK, I'm going to go ahead with that project.
We'll all look forward to that. So for folks who would like to purchase signed copies of Bruce's book, Washington at the Plow, you can log into the VMHC website and go to our museum store and order copies. And again, thank you, Bruce Ragsdale, for a fascinating talk today. And I hope that everybody will be able to join us in person in January for Mary DeCredico's talk for the Banner Lecture Series. So thank you very much. Good afternoon and happy holidays.